Principal Center Radio is brought to you by Repertoire, the professional writing app for instructional leaders. Learn more at principalcenter.com/repertoire, and by the Human Resources Excellence Cohort, now enrolling for the 2023-2024 school year. Learn more at principalcenter.com/HRX.
Welcome to Principal Center Radio, helping you build capacity for instructional leadership. Here's your host, Director of the Principal Center, Dr. Justin Bader.
Welcome everyone to Principal Center Radio. I'm your host, Justin Bader, and I'm honored to welcome back to the program Mitch Weathers, who was actually my very first guest here nearly a decade ago on Principal Center Radio. And we're back today to discuss Mitch's new book, Executive Functions for Every Classroom, Creating Safe and Predictable Learning Environments, grades 3 through 12. Mitch is the founder and CEO of Organized Binder and a veteran high school science teacher who pioneered the Organized Binder approach that has helped tens of thousands of students in grades 3 through 12 and at the college level succeed by providing them with an organized system that we'll talk about today.
And now, our feature presentation.
Mitch, welcome back to Principal Center Radio.
Thanks, Justin. Really fun to be back with you. I can't believe it's been that long.
Time flies, and we have talked about your system before, but your new book is all about teaching executive function, and I love the way you explain and explore exactly how that works within your system. For starters, what got you interested in executive functions?
Great question, and I didn't have the language for it, for sure, but when I started teaching, over 20 years ago now, I was struck by the fact that many of my students, the way I said it then was, as I got to know them, I'm like, oh, you don't know how to do school. You're incredibly capable. I, at that time, was working at a large, comprehensive Title I public school, and most of my students were multi-language learners, and they had just struggled academically for most of their time in school. But as I said, they were incredibly gifted. And it just kind of struck me, like, you don't know how to do this school thing. And the good thing for you is I was never really good at it either. Like, in other words, I looked out right at the class and remember clearly thinking, I know exactly how that kid's feeling, right? And the way I described it was like, it's kind of a Freudian thought of like, I'm a passive object as opposed to an active subject. In other words, this is happening all around me and I'm here and I'm present, but I lack that agency piece, that like, how do I jump in with like dexterity and confidence and I can do this? And so I just immediately, and it's never left me, I've always since that time seen the development of these skills and habits as the primary or foundational work in education, and the content or the things we teach as secondary. And I don't mean that in a one's more important than the other, but in kind of order of operations, if you will. So that's where my initial interest came from. And I've just kind of taken a deep dive ever since. And here I am talking to you.
You mentioned in the book that the Organized Binder system began in your own classroom and then someone else came to see it. And that's kind of what got you thinking about how to maybe kind of formalize this and communicate it to other people?
Right. I had no intention of I wasn't against sharing what I was doing, but as I started to try to work on this idea of developing studentness, which is a term coined by an Organized Binder school, not mine, but I love it, right? It's like all the stuff you got to be able to do to be successful, regardless of what you're learning or your grade level or subject. For me, it really was kind of evolving out of my work in terms of bringing clarity to that process and being really explicit. And for me, if I could communicate my routine or my procedures, expectations, call them what you want, non-verbally or as much as possible through visual cueing, the better. And so the idea of a binder and that visual cueing, and I was just trying to, again, help my students develop these skills. And my dear friend now, Nick Muse, English teacher, stopped by, working with the same population. I'll never forget, he was like, hey, and not just like other teacher, he was saying, the kids are talking about this. My students are talking about this binder in your class, and they're really excited, and they feel good about it. And, what are you doing? Tell me about it. And I said, here, this is this thing. You want to try it out? And we talked about it, and he rolled it out in his classroom. And a few other colleagues stopped by in time. And then the next year, interestingly, again, not my decision, but we had redesigned the high school in ninth grade, totally teacher-led, into 5 independent learning communities. We call them houses. And somebody suggested that we should adopt this binder that Mitch has created in all of our classes. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was really kind of an epiphany at that point, because I saw it in, all these different learning contexts, different subjects and environments, electives and core classes and whatnot. And it really became, in some ways, not the only thing, but in a lot of ways, the glue for that program because of the consistency. And that's one of the keys for teaching these executive functioning skills. But that predictable routine that students started seeing in every class was really profound. It had a pretty significant impact both on teaching and learning. So, yep, it's all thanks to Nick Muse stopping by.
As I think about my time as a middle school teacher and, seeing my own kids as a parent and seeing just the different pieces that have to be in place for students to benefit from school and get their work done and stay on top of things, especially as they get older and they get more responsibility for assignments, like we've all seen the kid who just kind of shoves everything in their backpack, just loose, just the papers wadded in. And as a teacher, I realized that there were things I could do that I didn't know about Organized Binder. I didn't know about your approaches, but I knew there were things I could do to kind of set my students up for success. And if I was intentional about them, I was likely to get better results. I was likely to see my students turn in their work more, keep track of their work better, understand kind of where we were in the unit, keep track of their learning better, if I put some pieces in place. And I think my school used planners, and I probably asked students to keep their work in a folder or something like that. What are some of the key executive function and organizational links that you talk about in the book? Because there are lots of executive functions. We could talk about working memory. We could talk about impulse control. There are lots and lots of executive functions, but there are specific executive functions that you tie to particular pieces of your system. Talk to us about some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on a good point there. And it's always fascinated me that as students start to hone or develop these executive functioning skills, we see content area gains that you just mentioned, whether it even just like turning in work that was stuffed in a book bag or the digital version of the book bag. Like you open up a kid's Google Drive or Classroom and you're like, whoa, like what? So just as I start to hone these skills, we see content area or course or grade level improvements. And yet if we're focusing on we're not even talking about the content, right? We're talking about developing this capacity in learners. And so making those links, the link really is this, I think, and this is kind of a thesis running through this book. And I want everybody listening to hear this very clearly, that although you'll hear me often say something or give a webinar on teaching how to teach executive functions, I'm convinced that they're not actually taught in a kind of a traditional sense, didactic sense of the word, but that they're best learned when students see them modeled for them and they get practice employing them by virtue of a predictable learning routine, right? And those two things are what bring about clarity in this process. So in the book, I talk about 3 keys right at the beginning. The 3 keys for teaching executive functions. It's 3 words: clarity, routine, and modeling. And the good news for teachers is, and first of all, I've never met a teacher or a parent or a school leader that doesn't want students developing these skill sets. Right? These skill sets. And in the book specifically, we do address, I talk about working memory, self-regulation, planning and time management, or of course, organizational skills, goal setting, right? So there's some very specifics there. But here's the thing. I also address and talk about, well, if everybody wants young people to develop these, and we know that there's significant impacts both in academics and lifelong, implications when students do develop them, and they are more successful with all of that when they develop them younger and younger. So why have they been left up to chance historically? Why don't we teach them in K-12. Just it's usually not the case. And I think I figured that out is one, it's a time crunch. Teachers never have enough time. We don't have enough time to get through what we're tasked with teaching in the first place. So where am I going to add in a lesson or a unit on the importance of goal setting or whatnot, right? And the other thing is what I refer to as a teacher's zone of genius, right? You might be a fourth grade teacher and you're like, this is what I do, or a high school science teacher or whatever it is. It's like, this is my domain. This is my zone of genius and I do it really well. I'm really proud of it. And although I want my kids to develop these skills, I may not fully be versed in that. Like what is working memory and how do I enhance that in my students, right? So the good news with the 3 keys is it has a very small time footprint in the classroom. What the book explains is by establishing a predictable learning routine, and by predictable, it means it's consistently implemented every day, just how we begin, how we transition, how we conclude, right? Just the rhythm, to borrow a phrase from the Waldorf community, the kind of routine or rhythm to the day that I can just depend on. It's predictable, which I think creates safer learning environments. And when students are consistently in safer learning environments, they're more likely to take risks inherent to learning. And there's risk involved in learning because you could fail. So feeling safe is important, and that predictable routine can help establish that. But if by virtue of just engaging with my classmates, or what I like to refer to as the learning community, just by engaging in this routine, regardless of grade level or content area, I get practice with this skill set and I start to see some of those gains that you mentioned in your middle school class. So that's the link. It's the good news for teachers is it's just about routine and modeling. And that's where Organized Binder comes in. If you're new to it, take a look at the website and you'll see it's a simple color-coded, tactile, physical binder that's primarily about visual cueing so that I know where I'm supposed to be with my classmates on each step of this routine. And then by virtue of that routine, I start to develop these executive functioning skills. So it starts to become a win-win scenario. Hope that helps. Makes sense.
And I will refer our listeners to our previous interview on Organized Binder. If you're wondering what an Organized Binder is, well, it's right there in the name. It is literally an Organized Binder, and we've talked about it on a previous podcast. But it's really interesting to see some of these links to executive functions. And I'm interested in the cognitive load aspect because as students get older, you point out in the book that often we lose students in the transitions from elementary to middle school, from middle school to high school, and even in the younger grades from more of a teacher managed routine to more student independence, more student responsibility for their work and turning it in. In kindergarten, often the teacher is going around and collecting every single paper off the child's desk and writing their name on it for them at the very, very beginning. And of course, we need to build more student independence over time. And often we don't do a great job of that. And we do it differently in every class. So by the time a student is in 6th or 9th grade, they might have 7 or 8 teachers who all have different approaches. And as you shared in your high school experience, when you went to houses, there's power in having a common approach. Talk to us a little bit about the cognitive load aspect of that for students.
So important. I'm glad you brought that up, Justin, because that's where in the book and in my work in general, looking at working memory is, I refer to it as kind of the engine for learning. And it's also referred to our short-term memory. It's what we're using all the time, but it's finite, right? There's only so much available. And so when we say cognitive load, what we're referring to is reducing the capacity of working memory because there's a load there. We're seeing dysregulated behaviors and increased cognitive load for students post-pandemic and everywhere. That's a really fascinating byproduct of a global kind of pandemic as I speak with schools and educators now literally around the globe, and it's the same conversation. And in many ways, these are the gaps of the learning loss. If we look at it through a cognitive load lens, there's things we can do to reduce that. And it does come back to this predictable routine, but it reminds me, I was in January, I was speaking at January of this year, I was speaking at a equity and inclusion symposium at a district. But I happened to be in a middle school in a classroom. That's where my talk was. And I was meeting with teachers. And before I started, I looked at the wall and the bell schedule, and I I thought I read it wrong. I turned around, and not that it was district wide. So some of the teachers that were in my session were from that particular school, but I was like, do you have 10 class periods a day here? And they were like, yeah, that's the bell schedule. And I was like, I've heard of 7, like of 8 is kind of a lot. 10, I've never seen 10. And they, we're all kind of chuckling. But in my talk, when I was referencing cognitive load, I said, think about this. You're a 6, 7, 8 school. And if I'm in 5th grade, up until that time, my entire experience, each school year has been with one caring, loving adult in this environment. I feel safe. And now I find myself in 10 different classes every day that are like 38 minutes long. And to your point, of course, they're all different disciplines or subjects. So there's some cognitive load. I'm learning different things. But they have different routines, different expectations, all of that, different culture. And all of that, it requires working memory, because I refer to it as just like navigating the school day. Now, take students with learning differences, students for whom English is a second language, of any other factor that might cause me to use more of my mental calories just to keep up, it's a greater cognitive load. So what we discovered, as I mentioned the story with houses that you're referencing, it was a byproduct that I didn't even think about. But when you're working with students, I'll go to my EL kiddos, multi-language learners, the mental calories that I use navigating the school day, a lot of those are liberated to focus on what I'm trying to learn, or I'm reducing cognitive load, because every class I show up to, I know what to do to engage. I know what's required of me. It looks the same. It acts the same every single day. And therefore, the teacher can have, I think, way more fun in being creative with lessons and what they're teaching, recognizing that consistency is in place. Another story that I mentioned in the book is I'm getting old enough, right, that I have students, former students who are now teachers, right? And they've actually been teaching quite a while. And just this year, I had 2 reach out and ask about Organized Binder, about teaching executive functions. And they said, I went to a school. They were never my personal students, but I went to a school that used your program, and each of them, for different reasons, were in a tough place in life, and life outside of school was anything but predictable, and actually, tended towards more chaotic, as my friend Jazz in the UK says. So they were chaos navigators, and that's just their reality, and that's taxing as well. And they said, I transferred to this new school, and I didn't know anybody, but what I realized over time, that it felt so good to go to class to class to class to class, and I just knew what to do. So although I had all this other stuff going on, there was comfort in that, and it helped me engage and be more successful. But it was the thing that struck me, is them saying how it made me feel as a young person navigating, right? And all of that is, in my opinion, cognitive load. And when we can create these more predictable learning environments, like I mentioned earlier, that feel safer by virtue of routine, I'm not trying to figure out, okay, what am I supposed to do when we start in this class? And then where do we go? And how do, if that's all just routine, rhythm, repetition, and again, the win-win scenario, and if by virtue of that predictability, which I think just the predictable learning routine in and of itself to create a more consistent and safe learning environment is profound and critical. But if by virtue of this particular routine, I get practice with these skills, it's a powerful combination for sure.
Absolutely. And especially for students who have the least cognitive bandwidth to spare, right? As you said, students who are dealing with the most in their lives already, we see the biggest payoff, because they're the ones who are suffering the most when everything is different every period. There's all this added cognitive load. And for our students who have maybe easier lives, they have the bandwidth to put up with more of that. But if we have that predictability in every class, a huge, huge opportunity to help our students who do have more challenges that they're facing. Well, Mitch, earlier you mentioned the question of when we teach this, and I'm thinking about how a lot of schools have a homeroom or an advisory, And that's naturally a time that appeals to us. We think, oh, it'd be great if we could just teach all this during advisory and then we're not cutting into content time. Why does it not work to teach these skills, study skills, organization, time management? Why does it not work to teach those separately in homeroom or something like that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Justin, because I'm very convicted about this. And I think there's a few things that happen when we put any extra, let's call it curriculum or program into a homeroom or an advisory that students often, not always, but oftentimes perceive as not a real class, as opposed to, say, maybe if we're looking at a middle school, as my math class and my history, social studies, and homerooms kind of like check in. It's really important, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have homerooms, but if we put our SEL, and there's SEL and executive functions overlap there, if we put different curriculums or content in those separate from the other classes, my fear is that the perception is, oh, this is just this thing that we're doing, even if it's fantastic. But more importantly, back to what I was saying is I'm absolutely convinced that these skills aren't taught, which is why Organized Binder, for example, or what's explained in this book, is not a curriculum. If I was to keep it in that middle school, I'm a middle school math teacher, I don't have enough time to get through what I want to get through or need to get through. And on top of that, we have state mandated testing that happens like 2 months before the school year is even over. So I've lost all that time. That's just like, there's this tyranny of the urgent for teachers. It's just the world we live in. And even if I want my kids to set really good, strong goals, with, that SMART acronym and a daily task, where am I going to find the time to teach that? So here's a lesson on goal setting. And let's just be honest. I'm in math and my teacher's giving me a lesson on goal setting and how important it is and how to do it. That's kind of boring. I'm just being honest, okay? I find it far more engaging, and I've seen it, of course, over the years with my own students and then students with schools we work with. How about this? I'm going to briefly talk about goal setting, but let's set goals within the context of this math class for a very short period of time, maybe 4 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that, with an actionable daily task. And then let's see if there's an impact. Let's have you interact with those goals within the context of what I'm learning, right? And that's part of this routine where I'm not necessarily, it's really important to get organized, and here's some strategies for organization. Pick one and you should try it. It's like, but I don't know how to do any of those things yet. Instead, what if one of the steps on the daily routine in Organized Binder, it happens to be the third step, is take 30 to 45 seconds and let's get ourselves organized. Stuff we're creating today, stuff I might be handing out, so whatever it might be. Each day we're coming back and modeling for students, but giving them practice actually organizing all of their math stuff. No, all that. So it's more of that getting practice by virtue of routine, as opposed to saying, here's a curriculum on these specific executive functions. I just think that falls flat. But when students almost unknowingly, because it's just a byproduct of this routine, get practice with these skills, well, they eventually start to move, as anything with repetition, we try over and over and over again, right? That's where mastery and we get it comes in, moves into my subconscious, and I kind of have it now. I get this. I can do this because I've practiced it by virtue of this routine in a no-stakes environment. It was okay if I didn't get it right every day. It's not a tested performance or whatnot. So it's that practice and seeing it modeled over and over and over within the context of whatever it is I'm learning, that I think it really starts to grow roots for students.
I think that's so crucial when it comes to executive functions and skills that are not just skills in the sense that, being able to do long division is a skill, like not just something that's in your head, but something that involves physically doing things. Like we would all look askance at an athletic coach who said, well, today I'm going to teach the students about passing. And then they got out the PowerPoint and then the kids never actually passed the ball. Like something would be clearly wrong.
Great analogy.
if we're just teaching about something and not actually giving kids experience doing. So as you said, it's not about an explanation or, a curriculum. It's about actually putting a system in place and taking students through it just as they would at ball practice. They're actually going to do, not just hear about. And I think that's a mistake that we make frequently when it comes to executive function. We think we can just talk about it and then have it improve without actually having students do anything different. So if the study skills lessons have fallen flat, that to me, that makes total sense why, that they're not actually being put into practice. So Mitch, you have 5 specific places in the daily routine that you talk about that I wouldn't say take any time away from the lesson. We talked about the time crunch, but they're things that need to happen in a lesson anyway, at the beginning, at the end. In addition to teaching content, we have some just kind of management steps in the flow of a lesson that you say we can put specific pieces in place to develop executive functions at these 5 points. Do you want to take us through those?
I'd love to. So interestingly, and I want all the teachers out there listening that I hear you on the time crunch. I get it. It's the life I live. But what I've found, and I think it's fascinating, is when a predictable routine is in place, teachers share back that they find they have more instructional time. And I get it, because if we're coming in to work with a school or a district or something, it's that kind of old adage of like, oh, okay, this is something else I need to do. And if I'm in that, but once the routine is embedded in culture, all of a sudden, wow, I find like I have more instructional time. And the reason for that, this routine that I keep mentioning is really meant to the steps are meant to take the first few moments and the last few moments of the class period or the school day. And that's a big nod to teachers to say, you got a job to do. You have to teach these things. But like you said, there are some like management, businessy kind of things that are just part of every classroom, right? There's things we need to do. And those are incorporated into this routine. For example, we call it a kickoff, and we encourage right when you begin, take a moment to revisit and reteach previously learned concepts, standards, or objectives, whatever your class might be, giving students a chance to ask questions and get misconceptions cleared up, and helping you bring about clarity to the point of each routine. For example, if I'm going to stick with our middle school math class scenario, but if I saw you on Friday, here we are on Monday, what was the point of my lesson on Friday that I really hoped you got, like that, those things or that thing? Because if I don't know, I'm pretty sure the students aren't going to have much clarity around that. But if you are bringing that clarity to each and every lesson, then you can take a moment, distill that concept down to a prompt that gives students the chance to interact with it again. Okay, that's our simple first step in our starting routine. But think about this now, Justin. If I'm reviewing and reteaching, revisiting things from Thursday or Friday, that whenever I saw you last, that requires students to employ something called retrieval practice, which simply put is going back and accessing something I learned or experienced previously, but holding it in kind of cognitive space long enough to do something with it. That's the working memory piece. And we know that working memory, it's not necessarily that we can increase, the cognitive science is saying you can't really increase the capacity of it, but I'd like to, and I use this word in the book, refer to it as flexing a student's working memory. So I'm using it by virtue of retrieval practice. I happen to be clearing up misconceptions and answering your questions. So it's bringing about that clarity, but it's really about flexing your working memory, that retrieval practice, allowing for what the authors of Powerful Teaching and my friend Patrice Bain, who wrote the foreword for my book, which I'm so honored and humbled by. They have a great line in their book that to transform learning, we must give students opportunities, and I'm paraphrasing, to get information out, right? Get information out, which is kind of a messy process. And I appreciate the dichotomy there, because as teachers, we spend a lot of time trying to get information in, right? This is what we're learning. So that retrieval practice, working memory, we start there. Okay, next step, introduce the lesson, increase that, and that's about predictability. Here's what we're doing today. And in Organized Binder, we happen to call it an agenda, and it models, it's not a calendar, but maybe I should use the word mimics the layout of a calendar. And we work with teachers to explain, like, how can you model for students that skill of planning ahead, like, oh, this is due in 2 weeks. I'm going to put that on my calendar. The point of it is just to talk about what we're doing today and maybe spend 30 seconds, 45 seconds introducing the lesson, which I think is important. But we can also model that skill. And then the third step in our routine, as I mentioned earlier, is we call it the table of contents. And it's just taking a moment to get organized, right? And if you do that every day, even if someone stuffed the stuff in the book bag at some point since the last time you saw them, you're going to find it and put it behind a very simple table of contents. And all of this is being modeled for students in class. They can see it and they're doing it themselves, but they're physically doing it. So it's working memory, time and task management. Let's get ourselves organized, which is the organizational piece. The fourth part is actually not used every day. It's something we call a toolkit, and helping students differentiate between curriculum, stuff from this particular maybe unit of study, and my resources and tools that I need throughout the school year, my reference materials, the things that I need to quickly be able to get to. Even though I was introduced to them in September, I'm going to need them in April. That would go in our toolkit, okay? Differentiating that. Again, we're not hitting that every day. So this is how simple it is, teachers. Beginning routine, time and task management to introduce the lesson. Let's get organized, jump into your lesson. And then at the end, we have a very simple concluding routine in the same way that we begin with a reflection and retrieval practice of concepts or standards that we learned previously. We do the same thing, but with the stuff that we learned or experienced today. So it's back to retrieval practice. It's back to working memory. And ultimately what that's doing is it's increasing the number of exposures students have to what they're learning. And it's just by routine, Justin. There's no extra work that's put on teachers because they're already teaching all of this. That's the whole point of it being within the context of what we're learning. So think about it this way, and Marzano and others suggest that the more exposures teachers have or students have to what they're learning, the more likely they are to get it. So you give your lesson, first exposure. At the end, just by routine, we just have this kind of reflection, digest time of what I'm learning, what I might be confused about. That gives teachers a target, so they're actually beginning with the end in mind. If I do have you for 38 minutes, what do I hope you can articulate or demonstrate or make connections to at the end of this? Like, what's our aim? So that kind of informs that concluding routine and what we're reflecting on. And if I give any next steps or practice outside of school, because we know homework is not a formative assessment, it's both unreliable and inequitable when it's used that way, and yet historically it has been. But if we do give some practice outside of school, that could be my third exposure. And when you come back to me 24 hours later, within moments of beginning, guess where we go back? We're going back to that concept or standard or objective. And so within 24 hours, I could have, by virtue of routine, not doing anything extra, giving students as many as 4 exposures and interactions with what they're learning, which is what's going to boost retention and help them learn. So I hope that gives you a snapshot I'm so visual that I'd love to be here with a keynote and showing everybody, but I hope you can kind of envision that.
Yeah, well, I've got my physical organized binder pulled out in front of me, and just for anybody who hasn't seen this, the beginning and ending routines focused on working memory, you're talking about using the weekly Lifeline sheet, which we would consider, like, people might say this is a warm up or a do now at the beginning, and then an exit ticket or a formative assessment at the end. So that's a page that students write on at the beginning of class and at the end of class, correct? And then there's a page for the agenda and kind of the learning targets and assignments. There's a toolkit page. And then there's also a table of contents. Talk to us a little bit about the assignment table of contents and the role that plays both for the students' organization and for the teachers' organization.
Yeah, so that you hit on something very key there, is that we talk a lot about executive functioning for students. Let's just be honest, teachers, some of us struggle with executive dysfunction as well. And what I've seen is, let's just look at, you brought up organization, Justin. When a teacher struggles organizationally, it can exacerbate the issue for students who also struggle with executive dysfunction. So by virtue of routine, there's always a class sample, and that's that modeling piece so students can see it. But the truth is, it's organizing teachers as well. And specifically, the table of contents that you're referencing, which if anybody knows organized binder, that's tab G. And there's one for each unit of study. Every teacher I've ever met, regardless of grade level or subject area, teaches through some type of thematic unit of curriculum. And that table of contents is simply meant to be a framework to capture or help a teacher organize the sequence of that unit, as opposed to organizing materials based on the category or type of assignment. In other words, here's a section for my notes. Here's a section for homework or quizzes, or however we might categorize things in a grade book. The problem with doing it that way is it takes this unit sequencing that I've worked so hard, my unit lesson plan, and it rips it all apart. Because the notes that I take, and I address this in the book in some depth, are most likely in context or in conjunction with the other things in this unit that I'm either creating or receiving or taking out of a consumable. So let's capture that sequencing on a table of contents so that at the end of the unit, I have this unit chunk or unit packet, and it's evidence of my work and my effort and all of that neatly chunked in these thematic units. And if we do that each unit throughout the school year, this is another byproduct of all of this, is students and teachers create a course long, a year long, or however long the course is. If it's college, it's a semester, portfolio from the very first day that they rolled this out to the end that students take with them, right? So although schools purchase materials for Organized Binder, they're really a gift to the student, right? So the thing that's happening for the teacher, though, now think about this, in planning the next year, they have this class sample that has for every lesson of the school year, a kickoff or a beginning prompt, an explanation of what we're going to do in the lesson, that's the agenda, a table of contents for each unit, a toolkit for the whole class, and a reflection prompt for every day of the school year. That's pretty powerful when you look at like PLC work and subject area collaboration. Like if we're all on that same page with routine, it can really amplify those aspects. So yeah, that's the organizational piece, is the table of contents you're referencing.
And I'll refer people again to organizedbinder.com to learn more about the system itself. But I'm very excited to see this take book form and really address the development of students' executive functions directly. So the book is Executive Functions for Every Classroom, Creating Safe and Predictable Learning Environments, Grades 3 through 12. Mitch, if people want to get in touch with you, learn more about your system, or learn more about the book, where's the best place for them to go online?
Best place for Organized Binder work in general is, of course, just organizedbinder.com. Interested in the book on teaching executive functions, go to organizedbinder.com/book. It is being published with Corwin's, and you can find that pre-order option at that link. I would love for you to go there. And in getting a hold of me, you can go through our contact form. A lot of people do that, but if you just remember my email, my name is Mitch at organizedbinder.com. I would love to hear from you. You might be a little disappointed in my social media presence, and if Sarah and others are listening to this, I know you're chuckling right now, but we are on all the handles at Organized Binder if you wanted to explore some of what we're doing there.
Well, Mitch, thank you so much for joining me again on Principal Center Radio. It's been a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Justin. Glad to be here.
Thanks for listening to Principal Center Radio. For more great episodes, subscribe on our website at principalcenter.com/radio.